Hello, my name is Sam Holzman from the Architecture Center of Excellence. Our affiliate companies are the Enterprise Architecture Center of Excellence, the Business Architecture Center of Excellence, and our Soft Skills Division that provides an understanding of the other side of the brain soft skills that you need to talk to human beings about those other topics that we have. And welcome to our series of broadcasts on topics that we believe are relevant to both business and technology professionals. This particular segment is on digital transformation, but actually the component that we believe is the hard part of digital transformation, which is the organizational change component of digital transformation. If you're interested, here's a little bit about myself. That's enough about myself. The heritage of this particular topic goes back a number of years. It goes back to something that we conceptualized in May of 1997, and we had our first client engagement in this area in July of 1997. And it involves what we call bioengineering, business, information, and organizational engineering. And full disclosure, a few years ago we added the phrase transformation as the contemporary phrase that people are looking at nowadays. And this order is important when you initiate essentially a change that we're talking about here. And this is a change. And I want to emphasize the concept of continuous change. And these concepts of architecture are the baseline for addressing and managing continuous change and the enabler of business strategy. That's what this is all about. And it begins with explicit human consumable representations from the business, which are then transformed into some technologies. In this particular phrase, we're using the word information. And then that, of course, affects the skills, the processes, the methods, the organization structure, the human aspects of things. And once we have these explicit representations in place that are consumable by human beings, not only compilers is what I'm saying, but human beings, then of course they will start interacting with each other as change continues in the organization that's there. And so what we're going to be about in this particular segment is the organizational component of these change things that we're talking about. In order for the business to become transformed, whether it's digitally or otherwise, humans are going to be part of it, and that's something that we have to recognize. It is a three-legged stool, and if any one of those legs has an issue, the organization is going to have a hard time that's there. Now, what is this concept of digital transformation? Unfortunately, it's not 100% clear. There's no single definition of digital transformation from a technology perspective. From my perspective, from the first computer program that has actually been written, we have been doing digital transformation. We've been transforming manual processes into other forms. And one of those forms, of course, is computerization, which is digital. No single definition of digital transformation from a human perspective. And this is the concentration we're going to have over the next hour or so in this particular presentation, both inside and the outside the organization. What changes are required? What is this thing? How are people interacting with these new things that are out there, including essentially the technology behind it? Can't find a definition on how this actually affects the human beings. There's no clear responsibility for the digital transformation. There has to be someone in charge, or else nothing's going to happen that's there. And of course, you all know the various, we have, phrases out there right now. We have chief information officers, chief technology officers, chief executive officers, chief marketing officers. Maybe we have a chief digital transformation officer. Well, if that's a new title, how does that fit in with all the other titles that are there? How does this overlay, or does it replace some activities that some other people are going? It's very easy to essentially say, we have appointed a chief digital transformation officer. What are the roles and responsibilities, and how do they relate to the existing roles and responsibilities that are out there? It's unclear in most organizations exactly how that fits. The technological aspects of the transformation are usually focused on first. And this is, I think, something that has to do with where we are in essentially contemporary society. These are what I would consider to be quick fixes. Installing a new server, or a new process, a new technique, Hadooping something, agile programming something, believe it or not, to us is the easy part, that's there. It's the human element and how the business process changes. What we have to recognize is technology can only add complexity to an organization. In order to reduce complexity, we have to reduce the business complexity first, if we can, and then the enablement of that through technology, which is the technology component, will also have a reduction in complexity. This is one of the things we have to recognize. Technology alone will not simplify the business. It will not make something that's complex easier. And so we have to be very careful there. And of course, the third component, which is the human component, we have to recognize if we're moving that complexity line to the human being. And that's, of course, something that we don't want to know. Don't want to do. Technology change resistance is much easier than organization and human mind shifts. Having somebody use a new keyboard, I'm joking about that, or a new stylus, or a new interface is hard enough. But getting people to think differently is very, very, very important. And that is hard to do because all of us have biases because we're human beings. And oh, by the way, just so it's clear, any technology we use, once it's implemented, has a bias also. It's an algorithm. And somebody made up that algorithm or component or process, and it has a bias also that we embed in there. So it's not just human beings that essentially are difficult to shift. As we all know, it's very difficult to shift software programs also. And finally, the end game is ill-defined. The goal line keeps moving. What do we expect here? What's the measure that we have in place for digital transformation? How do we know it succeeded? How do we know when we're, quote, done with version 1.0 or whatever we want to call it? What is the measure? What is the gauge that we actually have there? Now, the source of all knowledge and wisdom, of course, is Wikipedia. Oops, did I say that? No, Wikipedia. And so we have a definition of digital transformation that I've pulled out of the Wikipedia library. Digital transformation is described as the total and overall societal effect of digitalization. Notice the phrase there, societal. As you'll see in this definition, I don't see the word technology. Well, we'll get to that in just a moment. Digitalization has enabled the process of digitalization. Sometimes these are hard phrases here, which resulted in stronger opportunity to transform and change existing business models, consumption patterns, socioeconomic structures, legal and policy measures, organizational patterns, cultural barriers. Isn't it fascinating? You don't see the word technology in here at all. It's about the human element and its business. It's the B and the O in our bio phrase, yet in our methodologies for digital transformation, how many of us are actually looking at those two components as suggested by Wikipedia? Digitization, the conversion, digitalization, the process, the methodology, and the digital transformation, the effect, therefore accelerate and illuminate the already existing and ongoing horizontal and global processes of change in society. That was my point previously. I truly believe that we have been doing, in quotes, digital transformation forever since the first computer program was built. And it's a head scratcher for me to figure out what exactly is different right now. And I haven't been able to find that mass difference that's out there. I'm thrilled it's getting attention, don't get me wrong. But is it just a label, or what is it different than what we did a week ago or a month ago or a year ago that's out there? It's a question for all of us, as we move forward. Now, a couple of examples here. I want to state publicly, and I'm going to state this a few times, I've got a couple of examples for you here. I and my wife are shoppers at Trader Joe's a lot. We love the store. I have nothing against Trader Joe's. We love what's going on here. But we have run into a few things that have to do with digital transformation that I think are appropriate at this particular point in time. Because as I said, most of the industry is concentrating on blockchain and containers and agile programming and business process modeling notation and whatever is out there today, Ruby on Rails and Pink and Hadoop and all these other things. And that'll solve world hunger. Well, I'm going to suggest no, it's not going to, if we do not recognize the human component here. So here we are. And one of the reasons that we shop at Trader Joe's is they have fresh chicken. And that's kind of great. I think it's kind of great that they have this. And they have a lot of it in a lot of different varieties. And we're really keen on the Trader Joe's environment and the ability to buy things there that are fresh, rather than frozen, for example. So here's one example of something that we purchased, which is a piece of chicken or a series of chicken. And this is the way, essentially we see it that's there. Now, what's the point here that I'm talking about? All this digitization. So we take 6 of these essentially, and we go to the counter, and the nice clerk there is taking these out of our basket and running them through the scanner. And it's not scanning. You see the barcode, and it's not scanning. And the young lady there is having a little trouble, and she sort of looks at us and smiles, because one of her objectives is to get us out of the store, because she knows that this is the last portion here. And she's fumbling with this thing, and she's sort of muttering a little bit. And I say to her, because I'm curious. I'm somebody that is very, very curious, and I hope I'm not, offensive or invasive. I said, what's the problem? She says, I've been talking to people about this for quite some time. She says, it doesn't scan well because you see the lights in the store, it reflects on essentially the plastic covering here, and the barcode label is underneath there, and it doesn't position well. And I'm moving this thing around trying to make it, and finally, she says to me, you know what I normally do? I said, well, what's that? She says, I type on the keyboard on the cash register miscellaneous food, and I put the price in $12.93. And I just smiled at her at this point. Now, why did I smile at her? Just think of all the technologies that you and I are trying to use, including things like blockchain, to make sure that we can, for example, trace the origin and the use of something like this, because if there is a tainting or an issue going on with this chicken, people want to be notified on both ends so you can do traceability as to what is going on. And here this clerk is interrupting this multi-bazillion dollar agile programmed, Hadooped, blockchain programmed system by doing something as simple as putting in miscellaneous food because she can't get the thing to scan. This is just one example. Okay, if we don't consider the human element here, and what we need is technologists understanding things by walking around, not sitting in their offices and cubicles, and the business doing the same thing. Now, there's a simple fix to this. I don't know if it's simple for Trader Joe's, but as an example, we were walking into Publix, one of the supermarket chains, and I pointed out to my wife, I says, I don't know if she's curious or not, but I do notice these things. I says, look, their barcode labels are on the outside of the package. Now, there may be a reason why Trader Joe's does it differently. I don't know. I didn't get into that. That's not in the area that I was researching. But isn't it interesting? It's just that simple of a fix. And again, maybe there's a logic, a business logic for doing it a certain way. Don't know. But you can see here how all the millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent on technology infrastructure can be broken in a heartbeat if we don't consider the human element. Now, should this person be scolded? No, and here's why. As she said to us, she says, I pointed this out to a lot of people here, but everybody just smiles, whatever that means. I want to stress again before I leave this slide. We love Trader Joe's. We continue to shop there. We're just pointing out to you something that really, really talks about why the stool has 3 legs. Delta Airlines, another example. This was in January 20th, 2019, Forbes magazine. Big article, Delta, we're ready when you are. Why am I pointing this one out? I am a very frequent flyer in Delta Airlines. 5.8 million miles. Yeah, my back hurts. 5.8 million miles on that particular airline. We are a frequent flyer. I have a lot of respect once again for this airline. And this particular article came from a gentleman named Shep Hyken. And yes, this is the title that he has right out of Forbes magazine, Chief Amazement Officer, the CAO. I'm not sure how many of you in your organizations have this, but I'm not sure what that actually means, but I find it fascinating that we have another C-level position that you may want to find in one of your favorite job searches, that's out there. Just joking with you. Now, here is his exact words in an article, and I'm going to obviously talk to you about what this meant to me as a frequent flyer with Delta Airlines. I have shared this interesting background to lead up to a recent interview with Ed Bastian. He's the CEO of Delta Airlines at the Computer Electronics Show. And Ginny Rometty, Chairman, CEO, and President of IBM, took the stage to deliver the opening address and talk about AI and data. Here we go again, looking at the technology component. Wonderful. To prove her point, she brought on Bastian to talk about how technology is powering the airline to deliver a customer experience that is, as Bastian calls it, magical. Now, please remember, I'm now going to be looking for a magical experience because the CEO said that's what he wants to deliver to us, the customer. Bastian continues with the comments. Here we go. Digital transformation is personalizing. It's not just building the capability, but in the execution and delivery. 2 key points. Execution and delivery. There's nothing worse than having the ability to take care of a customer and for the flight attendant or gate agent not to deploy it. Then, as a customer, you know they're not taking care of you. Mr. Bastian, with all due respect, it's not just a flight attendant or gate agent, as you'll see in just a moment. They're part of the problem, part of the solution. Everybody is part of the problem and part of the solution that's there. Use the data to take care of those needs and make sure that the customers know who they are and how we better serve them. And we're really just at the cusp of that. Mr. Bastian, yes, you are just at the cusp of that. Now, this airline knows a lot about me, as I said, because of the number of flights that I have taken with them and continue, by the way, to take with them. Now, I was taking an overseas flight one day, and they probably saw in my profile, please notice that I'm smiling, because this is kind of a joke. It's not a joke, but I want to make it a little bit humorous. They probably know that I like peanuts, and we know that in a lot of flights it's a difficult thing because people do have allergic reactions. But I was really excited on this particular flight that they knew that I liked peanuts because lo and behold, as I sat in my business class seat for a lot of money, I had peanuts waiting for me right next to my seat. Isn't that great? No, it's not great. Now, this wasn't a flight attendant. This is somebody that wasn't paying attention, and you can talk about all the number of people that weren't paying attention to this particular thing. And I'm just showing you a little bit of the filth that was going on in this particular airline. And it was not in steerage class, ladies and gentlemen. It was in the premium section of the airplane. Now, I'm not trying to be biased here at all, but if this area isn't taken care of, by gosh, you can imagine what is going on in the other parts of the plane. Mr. Bastian, this is what we have to pay attention to. Now, again, smiling a little bit, they possibly knew that I worked for Ford Motor Company years ago, and I was in the automotive safety office, and I really cared a lot about safety. And one of the things that I was, really fond of is all the seatbelt technology that was used, because it's a very good device for essentially protecting the occupants, whether it's in airplanes or whether it's in automobiles. So of course, what they gave me here was a premium seat belt that was, I'm sure, picked for me. Please notice the seat belt that I received. Ladies and gentlemen, these are real pictures, undoctored. This is offensive and dangerous, by the way. This is not digital transfer of information. This is not magical. This is frustrating. And so, of course, I went to the flight attendant and said, look at this thing. And she scrambled around and she says, well, we don't have another seat belt. And obviously, we don't have other seats that we can give you. What do you want us to do? And I said, I guess all we can do is smile, and hopefully you'll write it up for the maintenance area that's there. Closing the loop. What we have to recognize is that closed loop systems produce quality. Open loop systems produce defects. It's not just doing it. It's doing it and feeding back. That is an engineering principle. Closed loop systems produce quality. Open loop systems produce defects. Now, to make things even worse, last piece of this, as far as the airlines, and I saw this last year and I picked this out, don't lean back or touch anything. Headrest, seat pockets, a plane's germiest spots. Okay, what's the dirtiest part of the airplane cabin? Surfaces you're likely to touch during your flight. The Canadian Broadcasting Company Marketplace Series investigated which surfaces collected the most bacteria and other pathogens by taking more than 100 samples from 18 different flights in Canada's major airlines. Out of all the places that were swabbed, the nearly half contained levels of bacteria or yeast and mold that could put someone at risk of infection. Nearly half, not 3%, but almost 50%. The most contaminated surfaces, the headrest and seat pockets, which contained E. coli bacteria in some samples. I've always said that seat pocket is a toxic waste biological experimentation area in an airplane. And I sure wouldn't pull out that magazine that's sitting in there. And I sure wouldn't put my pillow in there or my blanket in there if and when they give those out, because I'm sure that stuff is coming with me. This is what we've got to think about. Flight attendants from the Canadian Consumer Watchdog series said that dirty diapers, excuse me for reading this, used tampons and loose condoms have been found in seat back pockets on planes, which could explain why E. coli was detected. No kidding. Okay. Former WestJet flight attendant, this is fascinating to me. Stephanie Poirier told Marketplace that staff typically don't have time to clean planes thoroughly between flights. Okay, now, what else is she saying? We don't have rags, we don't have spray on board, the flight attendant explained, as these are dangerous goods. In other words, they're not allowed to have chemicals on there because they're dangerous goods. So we either use water from the aircraft or a napkin. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to frequent flying. What are we going to do about this? I don't know. I'm not the chairman or the president of any of the airlines. But this feedback mechanism, and I don't know what this flight attendant has told other people or things like that, but I'm sure, unfortunately, it's common across the board, as we see it. This is the O in the BIO. And that's what we have to look at. And as I joke to technology professionals, if you're measuring lines of code, what are you going to get? Lines of code. If you're measuring turnaround speed on airplanes, what are you going to get? Turnaround speed on airplanes. These are the unintended consequences of not thinking through that closed loop in all those three areas. I want to close this out by saying once again, I have a tremendous respect for Delta Airlines and what they do. They are really a joy to fly. I have a tremendous respect for Trader Joe's. They have some tremendously good products and quality activities going on in that organization. I'm only pointing these out as examples, and I'm sure there's tons of others that you have probably seen in your own activity. So this third leg of the stool we call organizational engineering. Now that word engineering sometimes has the connotation, essentially of equations and mathematics, but what it is applying an engineering discipline to essentially look at this other component, which is organization. And the engineering discipline tends to have four sort of phases in the engineering community: architect, analyze, design, and assemble. Architect, analyze, design, and assemble is what we tend to see in the engineering, essentially highest maturity level organizations. And so we're adopting those types of things to look at the human element in our organizations because of essentially the recognition that digital transformation is well beyond just technology that's there. So organizational engineering is the activity of applying a process and engineering principles to defining, understanding, and analyzing the organization structure and reward structure of a business in order to support the mission of the organization. The objective is to enable business strategy as quickly and effectively as possible, and also recognize that is the baseline for addressing and managing continuous change as essentially the organization moves forward and as their missions, objectives, and goals change over time. Within the engineering activity, the first thing we have is what we call in organizational areas, organizational vision. Another term for that in what we do is architecture. It's the activity identifying and examining the history of the organization, the environment in which the organization operates, the resources it uses, the order to identify organizational arrangements and reward structures that again fulfill the mission of the organization. The objective is not compiled code. The objective is making the organization as agile as possible. That's the objective, because essentially we have this continuous change process that's going on right now in the contemporary world that we live in. The next phase is the analysis. That's the activity identifying the principles of operation for the business, how the organization will behave. What are the behavioral factors we're looking for to essentially make this happen? Identifies the categories of work to be performed, the people and selection process associated with the work, and the organization structures to carry out that particular work. The design is essentially defining the characteristics or shape and reward structure of the organization. Our organization design encompasses business level, unit level, and individual design considerations. The phrase that comes to mind here most often is, what's in it for me? What does this do to me? My career, my income, my prestige, my position, etc., etc. All those things are part of that. Then there is the deployment activity, which is essentially the execution of all these principles to do something and look at the effect, and improvement and optimization activities that occur. And finally, again, we have the closed loop here, which is continuous knowledge gain, which is the life cycle. So essentially, as these things go on and processes changes and business initiative change and values are realigned, essentially we get a feedback. Get a feedback mechanism to what is going on. Now, as I mentioned to you, we first started talking about this in about 1997, and we developed what we call the action model. And we'll be discussing this a little bit later on in much more detail at the end of this broadcast that we have. And I know it looks kind of funny the way you see it right now. You see essentially ACTIO in capital letters, and we have the N in lowercase. That's not a typo. It's there on purpose, and as you'll see in just a moment. And just briefly, the letters stand for A as analysis, C communications, T training and development reskilling, I involvement, O organizational structure alignment and development, and then the small n on purpose, and not just because of intervention. It's essentially the strategies and the approaches and the techniques that we have in place, sitting on the shelf, just in case some of these activities don't align exactly with the way we thought they were going to. And so that's the purpose of the intervention that's there. So the other possible bigger challenge, people. So if we think we have technological challenges or business challenges, as far as I know, organizations are still made up of human beings. And for the foreseeable future, I think it's going to be there. And I think it's great because I'm hopefully talking to human beings, and hopefully you see that I am also a human being that's there struggling or taking the opportunity in these same types of areas that's there. And what we have to recognize is we have some common pitfalls that we see in change. Naive expectations. Well, everybody should expect this to be good. I mean, I can't believe anybody would consider this to be an issue. Well, our philosophy, unfortunately, is a little bit different. What we suggest is we get one convert, excuse the phrase that I'm using, and then I go ask that under individual to go get me another convert that's there. Because it's always about what's in it for me. We just have to recognize that. Existing process bias. There is a bias in most people and most organizations to not change things because it's a disruption. And most people and most organizations are uncomfortable essentially with transitions or instability. Neglecting organizational resistance. There will be a natural resistance. There are fiefdoms, hierarchies, whatever you want to call them, departments, divisions. All of these things grow up over time, and they have their own pulse, essentially. They have their own DNA within the enterprise DNA, and essentially changing that is sometimes painful. This is an overused phrase, we know it, no executive commitment. We tend to call it the WINK initiative. Yep, yeah, we really want you to do this. And it's sort of like almost cosmetology that's there. And unfortunately, if you put lipstick on a pig, you still have a pig. I have nothing against pigs, by the way. Okay, so we have to recognize there has to be a real commitment, and that commitment has a measurable component to see whether or not that commitment and result has been met. Poor or no access to benchmarking data. Everybody talks about metrics. Nobody does metrics. So how do we know we're getting better? Or how do we know we're getting worse? Or how do we know we're staying the same? There's the as-is state, there's a desired state, there's a roadmap that will take you there. The question is, are we actually making progress? Skunkworks success. That phrase skunkworks has been around for a long time, and basically what that means is we can try some of these things out in a little organization or a little part of our organization, and then we make the assumption, we all know how to spell assume, that what we can do is just do copy star.scar. In other words, just take that and move forward, and the whole organization is going to react to it. Well, most of the time that's not the case. There has to be some understanding that scaling is an issue. In the physical world, I like to tell people, you know what? You can't take 100 log cabins and stack them on top of each other to get a 100-story building. Okay. No matter how much you learn from that one log cabin, it ain't gonna tell you what's gonna happen when you've got 100 of them stacked on top of each other. No direct tie to systems development. All of these things are coded, are essentially stratified and essentially built based on some understandings that are out there. And if those understandings are faulty, then essentially we're going to have a faulty implementation that's there. Organizational change is the least understood by most practitioners that are out there. It's a specialty area. It's that other side of the brain that I mentioned early on in this broadcast. And it's different. Compiling programs is very different than getting people to accept or adapt to change. It affects the people of the organization because processes are either changed or removed from the people. It's that, again, disruption to the norm that's out there. And of course, it's also difficult to detect problems and provide solutions. And what we have to recognize, it would be really nice if all of us had on our forehead a change meter, a gauge. Empty, I can take on new things, new responsibilities, new activities. Full, don't talk to me. Don't talk to me. If I hear one more thing, I'm going to explode that it's out there. It'd be really nice to have those gauges for a lot of reasons, but we can't do that. I don't think we can do that. So we have to look at other ways to be able to understand what's going on and recognize that there are 4 pieces to this puzzle. And the organizational domain is a structural and cultural model, how the enterprise is assembled. And once again, you can see how that affects the business activities and the technology or information activities. Describes how work is partitioned, reporting hierarchies, and how people are motivated to perform their jobs that are there. So what about this other problem? And by the way, I don't mind at all if somebody says, why don't you substitute opportunity? I'd be more than happy to. So what about the other opportunity, that's out there? The people issue that's there. And unfortunately, resistance to change is one of the biggest issues that we see if we go look at it. It's not that programs aren't compiling or we have internet failures. It's about resistance to change. And if we're not looking at that 3-legged stool, we're going to miss it completely. It's like, man, we put this system in here and nobody's using it. Well, there could be a lot of reasons for that. Now, part of it could be resistance to change, or there could be a lot of other things, just like we saw in the example that I gave you early on in this podcast. And if we start classifying these issues, we have all sorts of external forces of change, demographic characteristics, technological advancements, market changes, social and political pressures. All of these things are essentially upon us, and they're hard for us to control. Now, we may close our eyes or bury our head, as the phrase goes, but they're still out there when we wake up. And we have to recognize these external forces of change are something that we can't control, but we have to take into account when we're actually doing something in our organization. Internal forces of change, human resource issues, unmet needs, job dissatisfaction, absentee and turnover, productivity, managerial behavior and decision making, conflicts and leadership and reward systems and reorganization. The common thing that we see out there, I'm chuckling a little bit. My apologies if I never, ever, ever want to offend anyone. Well, we're not sure what to do today, so let's reorganize. And as the phrase goes, it's like moving the chairs around the Titanic. Nothing really happened. So I don't suggest that reorganization is a bad thing. No, I didn't say that. But let's do it with a deliberate goal and action in mind. What is the goal that's there? Measurable. Not improve productivity, reduce cost, value, employee. Those are platitudes. That's what we have to recognize as we move forward. Resistance to change is the emotional and behavioral response to a real or imagined threat to an established work routine. Real or imagined. To the individual, it's there. But it may be a perception. And boy, are those hard to deal with. And we've seen these resistance to changes. I'm sure that all of you have seen most of these, if not all of them. Ask new ideas or attack the idea or suggestion. Ask a lot of questions. Silence. Any questions? Nope. Troubled look. I'm not sure about that. This isn't fair. Mary over there, I know she's not here today, but you know how it's going to affect her activities? Or Joe, Joe's one of the newbies here. He can't do all this new stuff here. What's going to happen to him? Intellectualization of discussion. Okay, that's one of my favorite ones. If I use fancy words, perhaps this issue will go away. Bring us past negative results. That didn't work last week. That didn't work last year. The last time we tried to do this, it didn't happen either. We don't really have to, change. We're doing pretty well, whatever pretty well means. This is a great idea. I really think it's a fantastic idea. But, anytime you hear the word but, or however, you know what's coming after that, or a quick fix solution. The leading reasons for the resistance, if we look behind this, are classified this way. The first is surprise and fear of the unknown. Nobody likes surprises, except for possibly birthday surprise, maybe that even either. But people don't like surprises. Well, it's confidential. Well, I'll tell you right now, the most effective communication system in most organizations is the water cooler leaking that goes on, unfortunately. And I'm not talking about water out of the water cooler leaking either. Nobody wants to be surprised. And the more that we try the cover up, and we see this a lot in some of these, people that are getting, essentially nasty things happen to them. The crime is one thing, the cover up is even worse. There's a climate of mistrust. Once we lose that trust, it's really hard to gain, because people start saying, maybe this is a good idea, to something like this when they first see the new idea. Well, what are they trying to do now? Slightly different phrase, but very different. Fear of failure. Of course, now we have, please notice there's a smile on my face, our objective is to fail fast. That, I'm not sure what strategy that is. How about this as a strategy? Our objective is succeed fast. That's my objective. I don't want credit for failing 17 times in 2 weeks. Hey, that was pretty good, Sam. You failed 17, we were really failing fast. What does that mean? It means probably the following. How long have you been working here, not including tomorrow? And that's an objective that I can understand that's there. Loss of status and or job security. Somebody was at the top of their profession or their organization. Now they're in the middle. Peer pressure. You're not going to do this, are you? Well, I'm not going to do this. Or you are going to do this, right? Disruption of cultural traditions and or group relationships. There's essentially the formation of like-minded people in every organization. We are tribal. We are tribal. The world isn't flat, the world is tribal. We have to recognize there's like minds that are going on there, and that's good. There's a leverage that goes on when we talk about these things. Personality conflicts, we have to recognize those. Well, John, he comes up with all these ideas all the time, but he just walks away when the hard part comes, which is the execution of these types of things. That's there. Lack of tact or poor timing. People want to understand, and they want to be respected, and they're looking for a little bit of gentleness rather than a sledgehammer. All of us do. So how do we overcome these types of resistances? There are many, many, many different strategies, as we'll point out here, just some of them that we have used in the past. The one that we really like is education and communication. Constant communication, constant education. There are so many forms. One client we have, they call them lunch and learns. Once a week, if you give somebody a sandwich, they tend to show up. I know that sounds kind of funny. Maybe it's not a sandwich, maybe it's a non-adult beverage, whatever it is. And you're educating content, or putting this on a webinar, or putting it on the internet, or putting it, we have one client that periodically they ask me to come in and do a 15 or 20 minute demystification. And I was startled one afternoon. I was in this particular organization, and I'm sort of glancing at the television screen in the room, and I see myself. I said, "Uh-oh," that type of thing. This face is made for radio, by the way, not for TV. So education and communication is very important. Once persuaded, people often help. Disadvantage, of course, is timing, and we understand that. I wish I could come up with a gauge to say this time investment resulted in this increase in profitability or productivity or something like that. Maybe someone has worked on this or come up with it. It'd be really nice to see how these things translate across the cycle that's there. This one isn't good, explicit or implicit coercion, but sometimes you got to do this. You know, in the military, when people are shooting at you, you're not going to form a committee to study this thing. Hey, we're going to take that hill, because if we don't, you know, we're going to be looking at the wrong side of grass tomorrow. This is not good. This is not good. Okay, and we have to recognize that. But we can't pull that lever often. It's really, really difficult. Participation and involvement. People like to be involved. Not everybody, possibly. But it's the old phrase, ask for volunteers. Sometimes you got to be careful what you ask for, but you also want to make sure that those people are listened to. And by the way, sometimes they're listened to and the answer is no. We looked at the suggestion, and here are the 3 reasons why we're not essentially implementing what you're suggesting, rather than no. And you know what will happen? People will come to you again with ideas, which is great. It's absolutely great there. Facilitation and support. Essentially recognizing that this is a change and giving people the support structure to make sure that they are listened to and assisted in the change that's going on. Negotiation and agreement. You know, sometimes we get some great ideas from people that are out there. You know, here's what we propose, and there's a tremendous amount of brain cells in an organization. Well, let's tap into those brain cells, and somebody says, you know what, this is what I heard, but let me give you a little bit of alternative here. And of course, if the organization has the flexibility to be able to take those suggestions, it's great, rather than having a hierarchical situation where it's top-down command and control. And of course, manipulation and co-option. When no other thing works and the executive team or the business says, we got to do this, yeah, again, don't pull this lever too often, but we have to recognize, us as staff members and people as executive or decision makers, that sometimes this has to happen. As I said before, when people are shooting at you, you're not going to form a committee that's out there. One of our clients, one of the people that was essentially involved in this project, had a buzzing cell phone that kept buzzing and buzzing and buzzing and buzzing, and finally he picked it up and said to the group, he says, I got to go home, my basement is flooding. Okay. Now, he didn't form a committee or have a study or think about a strategic plan to prevent the flooding the next time. He said, I gotta fix this now. I gotta do something, pump out the basement. And he looked around, he said, anybody want to help me? you know, that's out there. And then we'll get to the more strategic long-term fix, whether it's a sewer issue or a wall's cracked or the gutters are plugged or there's a grading problem, whatever it is. But I gotta do this now, when we have to recognize the same thing's gonna happen in organizations. So how do we do this? So we've put a process, a methodology together to address this. In other words, to bring the human change component to this in a structured manner rather than ad hoc. There is a method to the madness, we believe, and we can follow a sort of along here. And of course, it's not exactly like this in every organization. We're trying to give you a pattern that you can essentially use in your organization. And it comes back to this action model. And I'm going to describe now, just briefly, each one of these sections. And we've designed each section with the same pattern. Our objective is simplification of everything we do, including organizational change. I'm not saying organizational change is simple, but the last thing I want to do is add complexity in an organization or to a process. Our objective is to minimize complexity in anything that we suggest to you as our audience that's here. And so there's a pattern on purpose. After doing this numerous times, can we build a repeatable pattern with the least amount of chaos going on in each one of these steps? So we start with an analysis. And we have the pattern here. The first thing we've got to do is plan it. What kind of analysis are we going to do to make this happen? And we get feedback as to what is going on in the organization. We then go from a planning stage to define this, to orient the participants in the scope that we're trying to look at. Then we design the analysis strategy. How are we going to approach the analysis that we're going to undertake? And we deliver essentially the analysis of the change that we're looking for people to have. And once again, the last thing we do is loop around in the closed loop system. We evaluate the effectiveness and essentially assess how that analysis activity, not the implementation, but have we done a good job of analysis? It's good to have feedback at each one of these steps. And we can do that now, or we wait until some of the actions occurred, and then essentially we can look at the effects of that. The C is communication. We plan a communication strategy. There's going to be various tiers of this communication strategy at the executive level, at the manager level, at the individual stuckey level that's out there, at the departmental division. What's the format essentially of this? Webinars, seminars, lunch and learns, memos, notes, emails. What is the strategy that's going to be using for communication? We define again that communication strategy. We design the various types of communication approaches that we're looking at. We of course deliver that communication, and again we look at the effectiveness of that, and we can conduct an assessment on whether or not those forms of communication were good. Sometimes we have to add some, and sometimes, which would be great, we can eliminate some of those because they weren't used. Training and development, reskilling. This is a longer term action. Once we understand down to the individual level, fortunately or unfortunately, what does that individual need to move into the new environment? Now I'm going to be blunt here too. It may be the decision that individual is not reskillable, unfortunately. And that's sometimes gulping and hard. But I'd like to take a scalpel to doing this rather than a meat cleaver. You know, we're going to eliminate this department. Okay. I always ask the following question, well, why didn't we need it in the first place? Well, you can't ask that question. Well, if we can eliminate the whole thing, what was our objective in the first place? Well, we're not going to look in the past. Yes, we are. That's the closed loop. We're learning. We're not indicting. Well, how come you brought those 17 people on there? That's not the question. What was our objective in bringing those 17 people on there, and why don't we need those resources now so that we can learn from the change that occurred? It's a change. So we plan this training and development and reskilling strategy. We come up with what are we going to do for the various constituents, how much of this can be done, what can we afford, frankly, how are we going to approach these types of things. And we define essentially the reskilling approach that we're going to take. We develop essentially a series of requirements to be able to do this. And then, of course, we design that. And, you know, there could be various ways to do this thing. And one of the great things about the technology that's out there today, there are many forms of that, from individual learning to essentially classroom environments, the old days, which I still love. I believe that my friends require a handshake, not a notch on a computer system, but I know I'm old, you know, that's out there. Those are my real friends that are out there. And by the way, I don't have 1,400 of them. That's another story. We deliver the training or the reskilling, and of course we then look at the effectiveness of that as we move forward. Did it actually do something? Because this is expensive, and we know that it's expensive, and we've got to make some rational decisions. But bringing on a new individual may be more expensive, and sometimes, unfortunately, it may not be. But we've got to really think through essentially what the costs and the benefits are. Then we come into involvement. In other words, what degree and what type of involvement we want from the people that are expected to change and the people that are actually responsible for, for the change. The change sponsor, the change agent, and the change target, the stuckey. All of these people have different involvement patterns that we have to recognize and understand what is going on. And we design that, here's where we're going to be involving these types of people or those types of people in this particular area. and then we deliver that. We're going to have you in these meetings. We're going to have you review these things. You're going to be on the review team of these actions, and you're going to be the generator, essentially, of possible solutions. You're going to come up with, essentially, the skunk works approach. We're going to seven plus or minus two of you together to think about this thing for a week, not because a week is the right number or the wrong number, but you're going to come back with some 0.3 ideas, 0.3. Emphasis 0.3, not 1.0, 0.3, we can start discussing. And then we support the involvement strategy that's there. The O is the organizational structural change. This is not going to take 5 minutes, and it takes some responsible party. Once we learn what this change is and what the effect on the business is and what the effect on the technology is, we can figure out we possibly need to have a different organization model, that's out there. And we prepare for that particular understanding. We define the structure and possibly alternatives. We design different approaches to the delivery and actual organizational change that's there. We deliver that new organization and that structure. And essentially, once again, we look at essentially the end product, that's out there. And the final thing we talk about, again, that we keep on the shelf, that we don't want to use if we don't have to, is interventions. We think about what can go wrong. What if this? What if that? What if this? What if that? And we put together a series of approaches to address these things rather than saying, oh my gosh, look what just happened. Can we possibly get them all? Probably not. But if we have essentially an inventory of some of these intervention approaches, we can react to these interventions or issues a lot faster so they don't essentially foster negativity for very long. And we essentially design the various approaches to that. We deliver those strategies and sort of put them on the shelf. Sometimes we have to use them. And then once again, if we have to essentially enable any of these, we want to go back and say, what was the effect of that particular approach? And that's the ACTIO approach to understanding change. And the N is there again for the interventions. So in summary, organizational components of the digital transformations that we're talking about are one of the 3 legs of this stool. It's as important as the business transformation and the technology transformation, and some people would say it's even more important. There's 5 phases to each one of these areas. There's a visioning, an architecting, understanding of what's going on, an analysis, design, implementation, and then, of course, the feedback mechanism that's there. Given the economic realities that we see, technology will be exploited for good reason. For good reason. But, you know the word, but, or however, no matter how much money you throw at it, I'm going to now put it in capitalization, information technology, business and people must change. Coming back to Trader Joe's, you can see how this little change here could have addressed this potential issue that they may have with traceability. It doesn't matter how much blockchain you put on this. If you don't consider the human element here and how they may interrupt or help you that's there. So this little understanding, that feedback mechanism, may help us out. I thank you for your time in listening to this particular broadcast on the hard part of digital transformation, addressing business and organizational change. Our organization would love to assist you, not just in this area, but in enterprise architecture, business architecture, and the soft skills involved in that. I'm Sam Holtzman. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.